Hi, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. When we get to the time for opening the floor to your questions, we've placed a standing microphone at the end of the aisle to your right. Please line up and speak clearly into the microphone so everyone can hear your question. Also, we'll be recording this event, so you can find it on YouTube on the Politics and Prose YouTube channel later today, or coming soon, yes. So following the Q&A, we'll have a signing up here at this table. So if you've not already purchased the book, we have many copies behind our registers up at the front of the store. And we'll just ask you to line up starting here at the pillar, and we'll come by to ask your name for personalization. So please have your book ready for us. Once the event is complete, we ask that you leave the chairs where they are, as we do have another event after this one. So now I'm very excited to introduce Malaika Jabali, celebrating the release of It's Not You, It's Capitalism, Why It's Time to Break Up, and How to Move On. Malaika Jabali is the senior news and politics editor at Essence Magazine. Her writing has appeared in The Root, Teen Vogue, The New Republic, and The Guardian, where she was a columnist. She received her JD from Columbia Law School, where she was an articles editor for the Columbia Journal of Race and Law, and an MS from the Columbia University School of Social Work. She is a licensed attorney, has written laws, and worked in housing policy for the New York City Council, and the former co-chair of Operation Power, a grassroots organization based in Brooklyn focused on bringing black radical politics to New York City. And Jabali will be joined in conversation with Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna is the co-host of the Hill TV's news show Rising, and the host of leftist political podcast Bad Faith. Before serving as Bernie Sanders' national press secretary during his 2020 presidential campaign, she was a columnist and senior politics editor at The Intercept, where she focused on progressive political messaging as well as issues relating to identity and culture. All right, so now please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Malaika Jabali and Briahna Joy Gray.
So this is a real treat for me, not just generally because I'm not a huge fan of capitalism, but because Malaika is a longtime friend of mine who, in the early days, in the before times, was such a comfort and resource to me in the days when we were dealing with, you can't like Bernie because you're black, and leftist politics aren't for you, and all of that. And so you were an oasis in a storm, and I could not be more thrilled to be with you here today. And having read this amazing book that in so many ways does, in a fun, light, informative, compact way, what we were slogging through trying to do in the trenches of public opinion back in those days. So thank you so much. I'm glad to be here with you.
Oh my gosh, thank you for those words, Briahna. It's been too long. I would say it's like the before time is like BC and AC, like before COVID, where things just seemed more normal and just everything just kind of flipped around. So it's so great to see you again after.
Yeah, it's been a while. So tell me this. I know a little bit about your personal background and biography and how you came to left politics, and it seemed important from reading the book that you communicated to folks that you came to this in a way that's somewhat different than some folks that you might meet in the left universe, maybe at a DSA meeting or through reading Jacobin and the like. So what was your journey to the left?
My journey to the left was through a lot of black people. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is what is counter to the narrative that is often proliferated through mainstream media. And that's really what I wanted to focus on with the book. I center revolutionaries of color because that's who inspired my politics. And I grew up in an environment, so not just the left and not just black people, but in the Deep South. I grew up in Georgia, and there was a contingency of black people who decided to move back to the Deep South and create almost like a utopia. There were a few different groups, but one of them was called the Republic of New Africa. Like how black can you get? The Republic of New Africa.
With a K.
And with Africa with a K. Exactly. And so their politics was to say, okay, America has not been working for us. They came out of the Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s, where they said this civil rights project where we are being asked and tasked to integrate into America and to assimilate really is not working to create equity for black people. So what are some alternative visions? And that vision was a socialist vision, but it was also rooted in thinking about land, and the phrase we used to say was free the land. It was almost like saying hello. You just walk up to a black person with like a kente cloth, be like, free the lamb, brother, free the lamb, my sister. So that's what I grew up with. And then when I got to college, so I mean, that was, I would say, the underpinnings of it. But I didn't really have a language to talk about capitalism. I don't even think I really heard the phrase capitalism growing up. But I started to study it in undergrad, and then just like a whole nother world opened up for me because I was an African American studies major, and there's a lot more I could say about that, but that's kind of the root of it.
So we're both no longer practicing lawyers.
Recovering lawyers.
Recovering lawyers, we'll put.
Yeah.
And I sometimes say that unexpectedly, the most radicalizing experience of my life was going to law school. Not just because of the reality of student debt, which we'll get to. I know that's something near and dear and close to our hearts.
Oh, both of us.
But because of the experience of learning about the law, learning about all the ways that the system is very much rigged in detail, and learning about the ways that race in particular intersects with the law in classes and circumstances you wouldn't necessarily even anticipate. And I wonder if that was part of your experience as well.
Oh, totally. I mean, so I identified as socialist by this point already. But I still wanted to study the system. And I think there was still a part of me that thought, okay, I could do a social enterprise. I could work in real estate transactions. That's what I wanted to do in law school, create affordable housing development. And besides the fact that I did not like math, and apparently affordable housing involves a lot of math, there were a lot of things that you kind of have to do up until that point that just did not align with my values. So I actually see a couple of Columbia Law School peeps in the building. What's up? And so we have this thing where it's like, it's almost like summer camp for law students. And so we started off with the first few weeks where we are just getting some kind of basic legal cases and understanding, basic precedents that we learn in law school. And I had the same experience you did. Even without like having this kind of background, I read it and I was like, it looks like the early development of the law centered on empowering elites. And so this is like legally structured this way. We had torts classes and property law classes, or we studied that in this like summer camp. It was like, how come all the cases from the Supreme Court seem to side with like the rich white people? Like, how is this happening? And so I thought I was going to be a faux gunner. I wasn't going to be like a real gunner. But I was like, let me participate and show my professor that I'm critically thinking about these issues. And I went up to him after the class, after reading a few of these cases, and I was like, it looks like a lot of this actually centers on making our legal framework benefit rich people. In so many words, he turned beet red and was like, no, I don't think so. And this is a learned professor. Fully respected at Columbia and beyond. The next day, he gets in front of the entire school. I don't know. I've got a classmate in here. I don't know if she remembers this. She probably won't, but this was formative for me. It's like seared into my brain. First 3 weeks of law school, right? He gets in front of the whole class and he's like, I had a student come up to me practicing that critical race theory.
Stop.
Liberal professor. I knew nothing about CRT. I was 3 weeks into law school. I knew nothing about it. That's like a niche subject that you learn.
This was the early aughts. This was the Obama era. We weren't talking about CRT back then.
We were not talking about, professors were talking about CRT. Sure. Students were not. I knew nothing about it.
The world, yeah.
The world, yeah.
Fox News was not.
Fox News was not there. Tucker Carlson wasn't there yet. I was like, well, what's this CRT? Because it seems like that makes a lot of sense, actually. You know what I mean? But he tried to embarrass me in front of about 100 students in this class. And I was like, oh, so this is what is being taught at these elite institutions. I was so turned off from law school, like for the rest of my career there, because then though that's the same kind of framework and I would say propaganda in a way that goes into these big law firms as well. And so we're not supposed to talk about classism or racism or white supremacy or, any of those structures. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting to me because I remember it wouldn't necessarily be that the class was about the thing, but reading through the cracks, the patterns that are to emerge, this is what it really bristles me when folks characterize these institutions as bastions of like progressivism. They're not. They're not. They're status quo maintaining in ways that are invisible and I think therefore more pernicious. And but for having I think one professor who flew under the radar as like a Marxist professor. He never said it out loud, but he was my corporate law professor actually. And he opened the class saying, normally in corporate law, I would be explaining to you on the first day that the constituency group that the law is supposed to protect, the corporate law is supposed to protect, is the shareholder, and that everything about the law is about protecting shareholder value. I just want to put to you first, I want to ask the class if you can think of any more vulnerable constituencies that perhaps we might structure our law to protect instead, or to prioritize. And when people raised their hands and they said obvious normal things that you say before you're brainwashed in school, children, the environment, animals, poor people, people with differently abled, normal things. And then we started from that, the foundational understanding that the premise of this field of law was flawed, and he was a great man and I adore him. But I'm not going to make this about him. I want to talk to you a little bit about your framing of this book, because part of what makes it so fun is that you write it through the lens of a bad breakup.
Yes.
When I was reading this, I really felt that because the trauma is very similar. When you're talking about a relationship, the realm of relationships, and the kinds of discussions that I remember having with people, well-meaning people who thought of themselves as left-leaning and liberals, a lot of people of color even. Some of my worst fights in the 2016 to 2020 era were with Black peers and friends of mine over questions of why one should be a leftist, why one should pick this political candidate or another, why this philosophy that we're all kind of steeped in from the time we were born of capitalism might not be the best option for us, particularly as people of color. So talk to me a little bit about your framing choices there.
Yeah, well, when I asked Briahna to join me in this talk, of course, she was the first person I thought of. I was like, well, I think you would like this book because it aligns with our politics, but also we've dated in New York. So I think you might understand the struggle,
Amen.
And so, yes, there's a couple of things there. So one is the framing around relationships and dealing with a toxic partner. I was naturally coming to some of those metaphors when I was writing it because, if you just think about how long we have, I would say, been stuck with this system, we keep getting promised that it will get better. We keep getting promised that, Black people will eventually be able to ascend, and we just have to small business and hustle our way and LLC our way out of this kind of repression and economic subjugation that we've been experiencing. And so when I was working on one of the chapters, I was like, when are we just going to dump it already? But I used another word for it. A little cuss word, some cuss words in here. And so I was like, when are we just going to dump this system? It's just been promising us all of these things and has not delivered. And so a few relationship metaphors were just coming up as I was writing it. And then I'm going to diverge a little bit, but it goes to your point. Where it all gelled for me was when I was reading Twitter. This was during the pandemic. I started the book. Yeah, I started the book during the pandemic, but this was deep into it. Oh my gosh, I just noticed my cousin's here. What are you doing here? What? You guys came from Virginia? Hi. I was like, she looks familiar. Sorry, y'all. Come on. Anyway, I love it. So I was reading Twitter. We were deep in the pandemic at this point when everybody should have been thinking about structural issues. It's a pandemic. We have a government who has failed us in terms of just making sure that we were healthy, right? Making sure that we had adequate health care or even, PPE, just having protections. So people should have been thinking on this larger level. There was a gentleman, a Black dude on Twitter who was just like, I'm working 2 jobs, 3 jobs. I still cannot afford my rent. And I empathize with that. We know rent is too damn high everywhere. And I kept going through the comments, and a lot of Black people were commenting, and they're like, you just need to get you a 4th job. Why can't you get you a 5th job? You just got to man up. And so we associate financial success with manhood. We also associate it with being a true American and being a patriot. You're supposed to have that rugged individualism. These are cultural norms that we have established for swaths of people, and men especially. And then I think Black men, they also deal with this idea that it's more masculine. They have, I think, a higher bar to clear for masculinity. And there's a lot more pressure to be more manly. And so when I read that, I was like, brother, it is not you. It's capitalism. I also had a sip of wine. I was at the airport. So I feel like the wine and reading the Twitter comments just all gelled for me. I was like, it's not you. It's Capitalism. That's the book. I like texted my editor immediately. I was like, the whole thing needs to be a relationship allegory because I've got plenty of stories, not just about capitalism, but dating as well. This is going to work out.
Yeah, I thought it was really effective, in part because there is this part of the way we talk about politics. And you go through this, there's a chapter, I believe, on the myths that we're told and how to dispel those kinds of myths. I often thought that the most significant outcome of the kind of rise in interest in socialism, democratic socialism, whatever you call it, over the last 5 or 6 years, is a reframing of whose fault it really is that one's life isn't great. And I love your analogy. I used to talk about that scene in Good Will Hunting where Robin Williams hugs Matt Damon and says, "It's not your fault." And he breaks down. That's how I felt when suddenly we had maybe 1.5, 4, 3 politicians start to come down the pike over the last 5 years that would say things like what you're writing about in this book, talking specifically about the way the system is rigged, talking about the fact that, you're a millennial and you don't have the same things that your parents had at the age that you're at, that you haven't hit certain milestones. It's not that you are not working as hard. It's that their college cost $400 a semester and your college is costing $40,000 a semester. At least when we were in, now it's what? 60,000 out of 70,000. I don't even know what it is.
$400 for like a book right now. So
right. And talking about the structural changes that led to the gap between worker pay and CEO pay going from 30 to 1 in the 60s to well over, I think it's over 4, is it 400 to 1 now?
It's something like that. Might be 6
today. Yeah. Talking about the impact of lower union density on the on wages in the labor market, talking about all these structural factors that go largely ignored and invisibilized by our political system, and that are replaced by these cultural narratives that say you just got to hustle. Yeah. You just got to dig deep. I was in an airport. Airports are good.
Yeah. Go to an airport if you want to write a book.
Standing behind this black guy in a sweatshirt that said something like, I'm a black capitalist, hustle, or something like that. And I remember thinking, oh, sir, like, who hurt you? Like this, like, it's not your fault. I wanted to embrace him behind and say, it's not your fault, actually. But what's interesting to me is that this book is very much geared toward it. It seems somewhat framed toward an acknowledgement that there is a particular audience, a particular group of people in communities of color in particular, who might be more resistant to letting go of some of those narratives. So I want you to walk me through your choice of who this is kind of targeted to.
Yeah, I think in general, what I tell people is that it's for people who are socialish. So folks who may not be fully committed to calling themselves socialists, but so I'm socialish. Like I get it. Like I know there's something going on with capitalism, but I want to stay comfortable. I know there's something wrong with capitalism, and I think it's really unfair, but I need to have a job. I know there's something wrong with capitalism, but, I'm doing okay. Like, I got a job with a 401k, and, maybe I'll just donate to good causes. So people who know that there's fundamentally something wrong, but I was thinking about talking to my girlfriends. A lot of them are Black women, and we're somewhat, well off. Like, we're professionals. But we still, I think, are struggling to find a sense of joy and fulfillment because we still have to work a whole lot to pay back all the loans from being hyper educated. We aren't, a lot of us aren't able to afford a home. Or if you do, you're being stretched very thin, or you've lived in these like high net worth cities where rent costs have just gone, they've skyrocketed. So a lot of the things that we thought that we would have from doing everything right still has been, really elusive for a lot of us. So I want to hone in on a little bit of that frustration. I think that was a central audience, but it's not, the full audience. Any worker, I think, should read this. It's, it's a nice little stocking stuffer size. So if you got, some nieces, nephews, cousins, whatever, I think it's good for anybody who recognizes that there is something wrong with capitalism and they want to do something about it.
Yeah, it is. It's very accessible. It's very fun. I mean, I genuinely enjoyed reading it. I want to get into to the specifics here a little bit. So for people who are socialism curious, who haven't taken the leap, you do a really good job of confronting what their fears might be about what socialism means. can I still sell products in my business and make a profit? Do I have to give up all of my personal possessions? What does this really look like? Because I've been told my whole life it's going to be fascism, and I'm going to be walking around in a burlap sack and eating potato gruel. So what have you encountered as some of the biggest myths that are obstacles to people getting on board, and how have you dispelled them?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to do it based on kind of like a hierarchy of needs, right? So for one, you can't have financial security. I think people want housing, they want shelter, they want to be comfortable. And I would say for that, capitalism has already, I think, destroyed a lot of our ability to have that kind of financial security and housing security. When you look at so many other countries, even some capitalist ones, all they're doing is saying, we do not need to have every bit of our housing market or so much of our housing market in the private sector, where they can have rent speculation, where they can control the value of homes in entire neighborhoods, where they can hoard new houses and give them to corporate investors. So I think for a lot of people, recognizing that, okay, actually with socialism, that could actually give us more options. I don't have to be stuck thinking, I need to be stuck with a landlord who's going to raise my rent by 200% one year, or deal with a mortgager, a mortgage servicer who might, chop up my mortgage and sell it to somebody else. And then I'll have ballooning interest rates. Those are the two options that we get in the US. But you've got affordable housing projects where the government invests in housing. If you look at Vienna, if you look at Singapore, you've got these housing cooperatives and housing collectives. You've got community land trusts that people are interested in, where you can essentially own a home, but you're not owning the land underneath it. And so when you sell it back, you have to keep it at an affordable rate so that a family coming behind you, you're not going to make a gajillion dollars selling a home. You might make, half a gajillion, and we should still, we can be okay with that. So there's so many other housing models that we're not following simply because we associate anything with some kind of scary foreign threat. We associate the government doing anything with communism, and not to say, I'm cool with that. I think there's still some questions about it, but it is not a foreign entity because we have done that, and we have done that, unfortunately, before integration. We had public housing. We invested in a lot of these things until the government said, and until, unfortunately, some white working class people said, well, we don't want to share these resources with Black people. We don't want to have this kind of this social good and these common goods for everybody writ large. So therefore, we're going to privatize these things.
I think you do a really good job talking specifically about that in the context of how the student debt crisis emerged. Ronald Reagan, I think at first being deployed as an actor in kind of propaganda ads, and then later, obviously as a governor and president, making the choice to say, we're going to defund these California schools that used to be the crown jewel of the American education system, where people were able to go for basically free and have an incredibly high quality of education. The politics that were coming out of those schools were distasteful to the right, and therefore they became targets of defunding. Does that sound familiar at all compared to what's going on today? And also in the affordable housing crisis, I'm sure you've read, what's her name? The book about drain pool politics that was going around a few years ago.
Not some of us?
Yes. No.
With Heather.
Is this called Some of Us? With Heather McGhee?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, Some of Us. Sorry, my bad. That talks about how we used to have so many more public pools in the United States of America. But when integration happened, there was this choice that was made, basically, of do you want an integrated pool or do you want to have no pool at all? And how the racial dynamics often work as a wedge issue to force working class and lower income white people to make a choice between the wages of whiteness and literal public benefits.
Right.
That in order to their benefit as well. Getting into the student debt of it all a little bit. Reading this was an interesting moment because I'm sure as you were writing it, we were in so much in flux with respect to what was going to actually happen to Biden's student debt promises, the student debt policy. You interview Astra Taylor of the Debt Collective, who is one of the chief advocates of pushing the student debt cancellation. And I wonder what you make of where we are now and how you see it panning out, having panned out now that, you know, we're in the post student debt cancellation phase that I'm sure you were when you were writing this book.
Well, to bring more politics into this, obviously, you know, this might seem a little bit tangential, but it's really not. We know there's a lot of people who are visiting to go to the march for Palestinian liberation. And I feel like a part, aside from just giving Americans like all of the things, I think Joe Biden is going to have a problem on his hands. Like if he does not fulfill those promises of student debt cancellation, if he does not, you know, invest these resources into giving the public some of the goods that he said he might provide, I think he's going to have a really hard time. So I feel like that might, the same way that Donald Trump gave people, you know, these checks during COVID, it was like, y'all need to vote for me. And he, if we recall, like he almost won. You know, Joe Biden won by like a hair. So I feel like Joe Biden is going to have to really do the progressive thing that his administration said that he was about in order to curry favor again. Because what's happening right now is turning a lot of people off who might otherwise vote, who have just said, you know what, I'm completely checked out of this system. No party is working for me.
Yeah, he got 58% of the Muslim American vote or Arab American vote in 2020, and new polls show that only 17% of Arab Americans now are interested. There are places like Michigan that have large Arab American populations that are very much necessary swing states. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any kind of movement there. However, one, I think, really important chapter of your book is a conversation about why it is that despite the writing on the wall so often about what overwhelming majorities of Americans want, whether it's 88% of Democrats wanting Medicare for all, or Florida in 2020 voting for a $15 minimum wage by ballot initiative at the same time that they voted for Donald Trump to be president. So there's a red state who obviously wants red things, but also wants a $15 minimum wage. But 60% of Florida still voted for it. Given that there is this unanimity on so many common sense issues, why is it that we have this gap between what the government is willing to do and what the people want? Yeah. And that's why I was very interested in your chapter on corporate capture and money in politics.
Yeah, I think America is just way too partisan for a lot of this stuff to pass. So I think we have to start looking at a few things. I think we have to look at how we can empower workers. That has to be a class that we embolden more, that we empower more, that we organize more. You have a class of debtors now. So a lot of people who can't get jobs, but they are running up credit card bills. So as you mentioned, Astra Taylor with the Debt Collective, they've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes, negotiating with the Biden administration to cancel some debt from, with students who had been targeted from extremely predatory practices. So they're organizing a union of debtors. I think in the 21st century, work has changed so much. You have gig workers who can't unionize. You have temporary workers who aren't unionized. So I think finding new categories for people that go beyond red, blue, Democratic, Republican, because it is so ingrained where it's not about politics or policy a lot of times. It's about culture. This is my team. This is your team. And we don't want to cross-pollinate teams. I don't want to embolden your team, even if fundamentally a lot of the issues and a lot of the policy preferences are very similar and they overlap in so many ways. I think you're going to have to start thinking about just organizing young people in different ways on college campuses. So I think there are a lot of basically new categories for organizing that we have to create and to organize at a state and local level. I think when it comes to federal politics, there's always that rhetoric that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. And so we get dragged into, participating on a federal level. But the way Congress is set up, just structurally, very little happens in Congress. And that's extremely deflating, as we know, right? So I think we have to start looking at the local level. We got to start looking at city council seats. We got to start looking at Board of Education seats. We have to start looking at state legislatures. That's where a lot of movement is actually happening.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also really appreciated the attention you gave to the negative influence of lobbying as well. I always come back to this 2014 Princeton study, which asked the question, is America actually a democracy? And the answer was no. And the reason was that when you looked at the relationship between what popular opinion polls suggested Americans really wanted and what actually was legislated in Congress, it was basically a zero. There was no relationship, unless there happened to be some alignment between what some interest group wanted and what some percentage of the country wanted. But interest groups, on the other hand, had like a one-to-one direct relationship with what actually got passed in Congress. So this is an interesting question as well. Why does it seem like sometimes, let's say the Democratic Party will not do things that overwhelmingly it knows not just its own voters want, but generally Americans want as well? I think 49%, almost half of Republicans, also favor a universal health care system. That's the country we live in. It's not the country that we're getting. I want to take a few steps back because I realized that we started talking without me asking you to really define socialism and define capitalism, and to kind of set out what you think are perhaps maybe the inescapable pernicious qualities of capitalism that you think would make folks who are maybe on the fence about it and say, well, we can just do a better version of this, why they should say, no, we got to scrap this bad boy altogether. We got to dump him.
Right. I think the best contrast, because socialism as a defined theory came out of critiquing and responding to capitalism. So let's just to start with that, it's a small amount of people are controlling the resources and management decisions of a company using the labor of a large amount of people. That's like a basic definition. And what that looks like is you have a handful of folks who are maybe on the board of directors, and they can say, I lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for a while. They can say, all right, we've got this company, A.O. Smith, and we've been doing okay with car manufacturing, but we want to make more money. So let's just split up, let's kind of parse out this corporate strategy that we've had. Let's go over to China and actually do water filtration instead. Let's move some operations to Mexico. You just have a handful of people who make that decision, and they can decide what amount of wages to give people. They can decide whether or not to give them healthcare benefits. And then once those operations move, you have entire zip codes who essentially have a crater in their community because a handful of people decided that they need to find a way to make more money. Through socialism, the key feature of it is looking at how a workplace is organized, looking at how a business is organized and how decisions are made. So it's just essentially workplace democracy. And I'll segue here and just say there's like big C capitalism and small c capitalism and big S, capital S socialism, where these are like kind of technical definitions. But then below that, you have certain value systems. You have certain ideas that come from it. So socialism, like technically for just being specific, it's about how you organize like a workplace democracy. But it also means that we're thinking about other people. We're recognizing that this is not just an individual system where I need to just benefit and profit just for me, but you're thinking more holistically. You're thinking, okay, how can we, have food programs that actually benefit people? Let's think about housing that is not just a commodity, that is not a commodity, but we treat housing as a human right. Whereas under capitalism, you're promoting individualism so that people can buy into the system. You have people right now who don't want to, for instance, leave the State Department because they're worried about having a job, because they're worried about not having health care.
Health care. That's a huge one.
Right.
I saw that. There's this guy who is frustrated with Biden's policy toward Palestine, who said that part of the decision making about whether or not he wanted to leave the State Department was having a concern about whether or not he would have health insurance if he left. He's willing to take the pay cut, not have a job, all of those things. But especially if you have a family, you can imagine that if you are interested in entrepreneurship, even if you want to leave your job and start your own business, what is one of the key concerns you have? Like one of the key things, as you were writing your book, you say in here at some point that you were uninsured.
Yeah, I was.
I mean, that is anybody who's ever, the average American, goes through 12 jobs in the course of their life. Most people know what it's like to be in that interim limbo period, and to know the vagaries of having an employer-based healthcare system where your ability to be treated for an illness and perhaps avoid death, and for you and your family, is wholly contingent on whether or not your boss wants to keep paying you. If you just say it like that, it sounds completely absurd, right? Because also when you're sick, what can't you do? Work. Right. And this is part of what we all saw happen during COVID, right? There was mass unemployment. 15 million people became newly uninsured as a consequence of losing their jobs in the middle of a massive healthcare crisis. And this is what you were talking about a little bit earlier, and you obviously unpack in your book. This was a moment where the structural failures of our system became so obvious. And the government, to some extent, started to rise to the occasion and demonstrate what it could do if it wanted to take care of all the people that were falling through the cracks. But it was all very short-lived.
Right. Yes, and so I think that's another feature of a capitalist economy where the government just decides not to do things. And so we're privatizing a lot of these industries that should be public goods. We're privatizing healthcare. Why are we privatizing, people getting adequate medicine in a pandemic? Why do we still have to work through COBRA and have copays? And we're like begging and pleading for a few crumbs. Like those $1,200 checks they were so against it. Like when you have a system that is built on that kind of greed, honestly, this is what it comes down to. They refuse to do most things for the average person, but they're willing to help out corporate bosses. They're willing to help out, these private industries. So it's about just making more of the things that we need into the public sector.
Yeah, they call it Cobra because it bites.
And sucks.
Well, speaking of, I just had opened this page titled
It Sucks. Right.
Because I do think we live in this world. I had to sit and regurgitate and retain all of these statistics in the context of the Bernie Sanders campaign. So they're very front of mind, but I never want to assume that people are aware of the kind of statistical realities that have driven you and me and so many other people to have a fundamental collapse in faith when it comes to capitalism. So some people think, well, I don't want to offshore decision making. Why the idea of socialism in their head is I don't want some bureaucrat somewhere deciding where my hard-earned tax dollars should, or where my hard-earned dollars should go. I've worked hard. Why should I outsource that? So I think that your point about worker ownership is a really important one.
Right.
But this isn't about centralizing decision making at your workplace to some government bureaucracy somewhere else. It really is about workplace democracy. Do you want your bosses and managers to hire you and then make all the decisions, or do you and your other workers want to hire a manager and make decisions that balance the interests of your families and your communities and not just the bottom line for a board of shareholders?
Right, exactly.
So you can imagine, if you have a company, maybe they can earn 2 more cents on every dollar of product if you sent it to a factory in India. But is that going to destroy your community? Is that going to lose your job? Would you rather still earn healthy profits but not maximize profit the way we're told is the point of corporate law by sending the job overseas? So that's the kind of framework I think we should be in. And so these graphics are terrific. Your illustrator did an amazing job.
Thank you. Shout out to Kayla E.
Is she here?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Just general shout out
for
to
the universe,
Kaylee.
for you all to know.
Okay.
It's Kayla E who did the illustrations.
It makes it so easy to consume this information. You're right. In 2021, there was about $136 trillion of wealth in America. 10% own the top 70% of the wealth.
Yeah.
10% of Americans in the top 70% of wealth. The bottom 50% of Americans had 2% of the wealth. 50% of Americans have 2% of the wealth, and then there's the next 40% own to 22% of the wealth. So we're already living in a world where productivity is up. You make this point in the book with some handy graphics as well. Mm-hmm. Productivity is up. People are working longer hours. People are working harder. And yet the share of profits that the average worker is seeing is getting less and less and less every year. This goes back to that really, I think, pointed statistic about the gap between CEO and worker pay being 10 times more today, more than 10 times more than it was in the 1960s. It is not a figment of your imagination. It's not that you're not working hard enough. It really is that the fundamental system has changed. And so I really appreciate you walking through some of that. I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. I can keep going if you still want to germinate on some questions. But does anyone have any thoughts and feelings? Sure.
Yes.
Please do, so the people who are listening remotely can hear your question. Thank you.
So what I'm about to say is not to put you guys on the spot, because I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I just want to bring up some what I believe are realities. First of all, any of the systems can be corrupted. It doesn't matter what it is. You can get elitist groups and vested interests that control things, be it labor unions, be it socialist systems, whatever. So that's one problem I'd like to hear you address. And then the other thing is, I mean, again, this is not attacking you.
We can handle it.
Okay.
Go for it.
But the benefits that you derive from your education, from knowing the system, and so forth, put you somewhat in an elitist group. And it's going to be very hard to have people who are in an elitist group of any level to reorganize a system that may challenge what they've got already. And that's going to be a big problem because, and the other, I'll just briefly say, we've got too many people, we've got land problems where the land is divided up improperly, and I can't see how we're going to manage ourselves out of the situation we're in without a lot of violence. But again, I'm not trying to challenge you. I'm just trying to challenge the situation.
Yeah, I mean, there are 3 questions in there, and we could start with the first. Just in terms of any system being corrupted, absolutely, we're humans. I think what's important is to look at what capitalism was fundamentally created for and what socialism was created for. I mean, you can just look in the name, capitalism, capital. It places primacy on maximizing and expanding capital. And unfortunately, we have had so much militaristic violence and imperialism and colonization that keeps us from really seeing the full capacity of what a socialist government can do. And so I think, challenge for people is to say, we have had this system and that kind of inequality still exists. We have had this system and we have had the enslavement and branding of people. We have had this system and we have had young people and children be killed because we have gun lobbies who have an enormous influence on the Capitol, an enormous influence outside of that when you look at state governments. So are we going to dump that MFR already? We don't know. We absolutely don't know what a full socialist government would look like. But we have had socialism incorporated right in America. We have had Social Security that came from socialists. We have had Medicare came from socialists. You had a group of Wisconsin socialists who said that we need to confer these benefits outside of our state and create a model for the rest of the country. Many of them went on to FDR's administration during the New Deal. So we have seen the benefits of it. And the root of socialism is social. You're looking at how can things benefit people communally. So under capitalism, which we've experienced for, about 200 years, I'm saying, can we give at least a year to genuinely trying socialism? Can we give it 5? We don't know what it fully looks like because it has been killed because of the kind of vision and the kind of contrast and problem that it creates for capitalism, where they assure us that we can't possibly think about other people and care about other people. And I just don't believe that that's true. I don't believe that's the only vision for our country or for our people.
I think that's a really good point there also, that it hasn't been this kind of organic, democratic decision-making about what kind of systems that we have. We've had aggressive lobbying efforts and also wars aimed at suppressing socialism around the globe in here, whether it's the Red Scare, whether it's sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba. There was just a vote in the UN yesterday or the day before where every country, I believe but 2, voted for the U.S. to lift sanctions on Cuba. Like, why? Why are we doing this? Because socialism is that big of a threat. You've got this great reproduced brochure from the American Medical Association that had spent decades lobbying against universal health care, where it's a propaganda brochure trying to tell people that trying to frame freedom as a goal that should precede your desire not to be one of the 68,000 people who die in America every year from a lack of health insurance. Saying the people's decision will determine the ultimate fate of freedom and truth in this nation. You may be next. Would a socialized medicine lead to socialization in other phases of American life? Ooga, ooga, booga, oogie. You know, like that's the way this has been going on. Did you want to ask also you had a second question in there?
Well, my basic point is to be careful about selling labels of things because, I mean, the corporations have had socialism for a while now. I mean, they use it for themselves. So they've. But my point is, how are we going to get
Everyday
past
people.
what is human nature and open up decision-making processes, more sunshine to who's talking to whom, how decisions are going to be made. There lies a big problem because so much is done behind closed doors of any system, and we don't know what's going on. There is a big problem there.
Yeah, I think again, it's just pushing back on the idea that this is human. It's human nature to be selfish.
To some degree, yeah.
Some people are, but there are a lot of communal societies that existed before capitalism, where it was people were focused on bartering and
they were
trade
small.
and
They were
working,
small.
and they were working together. But I don't think that it's necessarily human nature to be entirely selfish and greedy and have avarice. I think capitalism has incentivized that. I think we live in a system where we are taught that we have limited resources and thus we can't share. There's like a literal term called Ubuntu on the continent in Africa, where it's about collectivism. So many societies have been rooted in collective struggle. If you look at Bolivia, if you look at their constitution, they've formalized an idea that was already practiced amongst the indigenous there, where it's about collective struggle and responsibility. We have the term in Kwanzaa called Ujima, cooperative economics. So there are a lot of ideas, and frankly, in non-Western societies where people did not put a primacy on just gaining their own individual freedom and looking at their own individual prosperity, and that's how societies functioned.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Yeah,
I
we'll move on
appreciate
to the
it.
next one.
Yeah.
I have a question to better understand where you're going.
Yeah.
Then President Ronald Reagan talked about government being the problem. And ever since then, we've had a relentless push to capitalize, privatize everything, and to reduce the role and the scope of government. Even though government is our primary means to social mobility. So on one hand, we have that whole argument and the denial of the basic concept of market failure. On the other hand, so on one hand we have government and the role of government. On the other hand, we have voracious capitalism that is driven to be more voracious by a voracious Wall Street and investment community. So my question is your focus on reforming the private sector versus a greater role for government?
Yeah, I think what the book does is argue for a greater role for government. I personally don't think that the private sector en masse can be reformed enough to have compassionate capitalism, which is why I'm socialist and why I'm advocating for socialist ideas in the book. I think that just getting at something that's basic that most industrial countries do. Like, we can start with having universal single-payer health care. I think we need to start there. I think we need to start with, for instance, reforming the Faircloth Amendment. I'm going to get a little bit technical because I was a policy attorney. And with the Faircloth Amendment, they basically made it impossible to create new public housing units. And so this idea that, like Ronald Reagan says, he wants to get out of government, the government has been fully enmeshed in capitalism. They have been fully enmeshed in giving these corporations subsidies and corporate welfare and making sure that we maintain this system. So they have created policies to ensure that we have capitalism and that we don't have alternatives. And so I think the idea here is really to transform people's minds. Like, I can't say I'm gonna start with, reforming the entire capitalist system, but it's about changing people's minds, which is why I wanted to frame it like a conversation with people, to be able to at least say, okay, when I go to the polls, I'm going to look to see who is trying to invest in public housing. When I go to the polls, I'm not just going to be worried about who's talking about CRT and they can't even define it. I'm not worried about, okay, what kind of drag brunches, are happening. Those are wedge issues that even Republicans know is distracting to people, because even they're saying Ronald Reagan was wrong. If you look at some of their newsletters, which I subscribe to some of them just to see what are they up to, what are these Republicans up to? And they're saying, well, we have to start looking at working class issues and looking at collective labor, looking at collective organizing more and organizing that. So I think just starting with people's consciousness, that's really the idea here. So they can then take that into their communities, they can take that into their workplaces, and then try and do something on more local levels.
Okay.
Yeah, and thank you, by the way. And this goes to something you were saying also. I do think it's hard to visualize some of this stuff, and I think you asked something about what's the plan, what does it look like, what do you do with all of these private industries? When we're talking about workplace democratization, I mean, not to be that person, and I have a lot of problems with him right now, but as someone who worked on the Bernie campaign, we had a plan for that. The workplace democracy policy platform that really lowered the bar for workers to be able to unionize, to be able to be worker-led, was, I think, the most transformative part of the platform that got very little airplay because they fired all the labor reporters from the newsrooms and nobody cares. But truly, this isn't like it's this, when people think about socialism, they think of like armed coups taking over governments and stuff. This is really about a people-led movement. And I think you're right talking about starting with healthcare for all, enabling folks to have the flexibility to make different kinds of choices and not be so tethered to their employment is such a huge part of that. Same with these housing rights, knowing that you're not going to be living on the street, knowing that you have a guaranteed right to housing, looking at other countries, and the examples that you provide in the book of countries on Earth in the year 2023 that are already doing versions of this is so instructive. It makes it seem much less fantastical. When you look at Singapore, where 90% of people live in public housing, when you look at any number of Scandinavian countries, and I take your caveat on that, that they are benefiting from a lot of colonial wealth that enables them to have that standard of living, but that have universal health care, housing as a human right, sending their mothers home with kits, baby box that you can use as a crib, and home health aides that will help you come to your house and teach you how to nurse and provide you pads for, postpartum relief, whereas we send our mothers home with a $30,000 bill. I mean, this is not fantastical stuff. The bar is on the floor. And
it's in hell. It really is. People are going through hell right now, and so I think we just have to disentangle this idea that thinking about alternatives is un-American. I think patriotism has just really warped our minds a lot, and it's warped our ideas of what it means to just be human. We think that we have to be superhuman in this country, and we have to attempt the impossible, when so many of things were not just possible in other countries and are not just possible there, but it was possible here. So we have to this is kind of history. It's like a historical unlearning of what we thought was the norm in America, when a lot of these things were very common, but they've been propagandized to believe that we just can't get back to that, and for a reason. The billionaires also run the propaganda campaigns. So, all right, we've got thank you. We've got a line here. So, yes, sir.
Hi. Hi. I just want to open up saying I worked in the labor movement for probably 40 years. And, just a point that I don't think can be made strongly enough is that the worst labor union is always going to be better than the best corporation.
Say that one more time.
No, quite seriously. Actually, if somebody dug into these statistics, union corruption is really pretty rare. And compared to what big business does every single day, it's a drop in the bucket. right now, especially in the wake of the UAW's success, it really should call on progressives of every kind, I say, liberal, moving to the left, to do what's necessary to strengthen the labor movement, including pushing for the PRO Act in Congress,
Yes.
which is now sitting dead in the water. In the Senate, as I recall, it was lacking 3 Democratic supporters. In the House, well, let's go there another time. But just supporting collective bargaining fundamental to the progressive mission, not like a side thing. Oh, yeah, we got to do that too.
Right.
But really recognizing that democracy, as we know it, or as we want to know it, is impossible without a strong labor movement. And all the reforms you were describing, going back to New Deal, none of it would have been possible absent the CIO and even the AFL. So anyway, just a thought on the matter.
Thank
something
you.
that can't be stressed
Absolutely.
enough.
Thank you for sharing that. Like we're big pro-labor people
Right,
here. So absolutely agree with that. I mean, I don't really have much to add to that. I don't know if you
No,
wanted to
thank
add
you so
anything.
much. I very much agree. I want to get to these next two gentlemen, but she does get into some of that in the book, which is why this is such a great, just a really great entry point for
Thank
people who
you.
haven't even really organized their thoughts. Even if you know a lot of this stuff, I found this useful because it helped me organize my thoughts in a constructive way, in a very persuasive way.
Thank you. And then just to give you all just some insight into it, Chapter 4 deals with labor. So it's looking at how labor unions got to be, I guess, weakened for many years now. And then Chapter 10 features an interview with Chris Smalls, who organized the first Amazon labor union in the world. So there are some key bullets about how they did that work. So you can find that in the book.
Hi. Of course, love the book. I was raised as a socialist, fell into not being a socialist in my work life. Now thinking how to get into it. So get back into it. Can you give us 1 to 3 ways when I leave here, how to go about being anti-capitalist, how to go about being socialist?
What this book really tries to do is to get people to think more collectively. I think the problem with capitalism is that it has forced us to be more alienated and to believe that these are all individual problems and individual failings when these are structural problems that require structural solutions. And I would say join an organization that is doing that kind of political work, where they recognize that it takes a group of people to get something done. So I don't know if you have the Party for Socialism and Liberation in DC. I would not be surprised if you do. I'm sure there are some Black-led left groups. I grew up in the Malcolm X grassroots movement, so you've got 2 right there. Obviously, people are aware of DSA. You could be a part of an Afro-socialism caucus. I have my own issues with having like a kind of a side caucus within a DSA, because I think race and class intersect and are fundamental to how capitalism has thrived, but that's just my own thing. But there are a lot of left-leaning groups. You can follow Briahna and I. We talk about this stuff all the time. And then lastly, there's a whole list of resources. So there's a QR code that I include in the book because I want this to be an organizing tool for people. And just to get to your point too, the gentleman who came up first, we might have gone through these elite circles, but that does not mean that we have an elite background. So I come from a working class family. My mom and dad were teachers. I have cousins, sisters, well, not sisters, fake sisters. I've got cousins, I've got uncles who are working class Black people. There's only so much wealth you can really have if you're a Black American in this country. And so hand it to your family at Thanksgiving. My mom has been all up in the group chat, giving it to her, giving it to our aunts and our family members, and so you can even organize your own reading group. So take this book, talk to 5 people it's like, we recognize these problems. Let's see who else we can join to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
This might be. Can we have 2 more questions?
We have time for 1 more.
Now, this is my friend from way back. Can she just come on?
She'll make it quick. We'll do this so fast.
No, both y'all, come on.
We'll both of you.
We got time.
We'll do it so fast.
No, I just so my whole thing is like, I hear you about like most people in this country, when you actually ask them, they want liberal policies, right, or what they consider liberal or progressive policies, right? That's right or left. If you don't label it liberal, the right wants them, right? So my whole thing is, since we're all on board as far as what we want as a country, even if we're divided, how do we actually win? You know what I mean? Because when you have people like Nina Turner, who goes up against big money, or Cenk Uygur, or even the members of the squad, they happen to win, but they were going up against a lot of big money. Like, how do you win against like so much power and money?
Yeah. You can actually, I feel like you've worked directly in this, and it's deflating, but I think again you have to kind of segregate maybe federal politics a bit from what can actually happen on the ground. I've got more to say about that, but
Definitely local is where more things are going to happen. People really don't like when I say this. I feel like we are largely disempowered, and people have to stop voting for Democrats. The right pulls the Republican Party right because they would rather lose an election than bend the knee to a Mitt Romney type who they think is like not right enough, right? And the people on the left don't feel that way. They feel very strongly that because our rights are in the balance, the Democrats are a party that represents marginalized people, that it's very easy to draw on people's very real sense of vulnerabilities because of being black or gay or female or whatever right is on the chopping block next. And I think those are real feelings that are legitimate. I think those are real legitimate fears. It is also the case that the ratchet effect, the long-term effect of that, moving right and right and right over the time, is exactly what has imperiled so many of those rights now as we sit here with Roe overturned and all of these things. And we're seeing now, I think, because of the vividness of the images coming out of Palestine, that tons of people I'm seeing all of a sudden are now like, well, this is the line for me. I'm not voting for Biden. And I'm like, welcome. Welcome to the club. Not because I'm like rooting for Trump or whoever it is to win, but because without that pressure, without Biden feeling like he could legitimately lose this election, what incentive does he or any other Democrat have to actually move to where the people are? That's my feeling. And also being members of these kinds of organizations, being able to do vote withholding in an organized and structured way, and also not being so pessimistic and, oh my gosh, they'll never win, when there are progressive candidates that enter these races, whether it's a Bernie style person or whether it's like a Cornel West style person. Like, people have to be more strategic and not be willing just to do vote blue no matter who forever. That's just on the federal level.
You have so many black leftists, even W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a part of a very mainstream organization, the NAACP. He was like, why are we voting for any of these parties? And that's not to say that we cannot be involved in electoral politics. I think electoral politics is crucial. We have to be able to control budgets. We have to be able to control the resources that go to nonprofit organizations. That happens through the budgetary process. We have to have legislation that works for us. But the legislation that's coming out of Congress is not working for us. So to me, it's not about like necessarily withholding votes, but redirecting where those votes go to, redirecting where our attention should lie. And so if you find any, progressives or people who actually align with your politics, use that energy on a local level, because that's really where a lot of those decisions are being made. And if we don't even have the threat of saying, that we're looking at alternatives at a federal level, then of course these establishment Democrats are going to keep doing this. What incentive do they have to not keep doing the same thing? So I think there has to be, not just, just my personal grievance, I don't want to vote, but like something organized where they can see a mass of people are willing to redirect where their energy goes because they're not working for us.
And to a third party. Like, we need a landing pad. That's why I think third parties are so important. Because it doesn't seem like I'm just sitting at home not doing anything with my vote. It's sending up a directed message that this is the kind of politics we want in the alternative.
Yep. Okay.
All right,
thank you for
letting us go a little long.
All right. Y'all know we could talk, so I'm going to hold it back.
Hi.
Hey, boo. This is my friend Cassie, who I've known for like a million years.
I just want to say congratulations.
Thanks, boo. Wait, are you in D.C.? What's going on?
No, I'm in Harlem, but I came here because I missed the Brooklyn one.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, my God. Hey, girl. I love you. All right. Yes. Wow.
So I'm really excited that you wrote this book because I think as a young Black person who comes from a working poor background that is been in elite spaces and got elite education, is organizing around different social issues. I think my relationship to capitalism is interesting, right? Like, I have socialist politics, but my purchasing power is very capitalist, right? Like the kind of choices that I make don't always align with the values that I espouse, right?
It's okay. I like nice things too.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Don't we
But
all?
so here's my question, right?
Yes, ma'am.
There is like the propaganda of Black luxury, Black capitalism, we finally made it. And also, you know, my thing about the DSA is like, well, how come by the time I'm able to get the things, now I can't have the things in order for us to save the world? And so, you know, I'm very excited for the book, to read the book and to gift it to all my Black friends for the holidays.
Kwanzaa included.
That's what I was talking about. Okay.
Yes.
But I'm interested in like this conversation with folks in our generation who come from like a working class background or working poor background, who are finally at a place where, you know, where we kind of leaned into the propaganda of like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, go to school, get out of the hood, do, you know, all the BS that they taught us. And then you get here and you're like, I got to break up with capitalism. I just got here. Right. Right?
We just met.
We just met. Like, maybe he'll be different from me, right? Like, so, like, how do we, you know?
Don't be a Khloe Kardashian.
Right. I'm like, oh, God, those Skims do look nice. You know, like, how do I start engaging that in our conversation? Because sometimes it feels like the more left I get, it feels like I'm losing out on the thing that they told me I was supposed to be going for. Yeah. And I find that sometimes on the left, not the Black left, the white left is like, well, you should just do it. And I was like, well, didn't you come from all of this and then decided to let it go? I never had it, and now you want me to give it up.
Right.
So okay. So there are people understand.
Okay. I totally feel you, and I think the key here is recognizing that neither socialism or capitalism is about your personal lifestyle choices. I don't think that there is ethical consumption that you can have under capitalism. I do think that consumerism is an issue, but that's somewhat tangential to what capitalism actually is, which again is technically it's about how businesses are organized, where you have a few people deciding how a mass amount of people should live and work in their day-to-day lives. It says we need to extort as much profit as possible off of swaths of people, swaths of communities, so a few people benefit and they make all the management decisions for that company. So being a consumer does not make you a capitalist. People who are consumers live under the precarity caused by capitalism. So that's something that I talk about in the book. So you can buy things. We had markets. People bought things. People lived nice lives before capitalism. So that's not what we're getting at. What we're really getting at are the billionaires and the multi-millionaires who are making those kinds of ownership decisions and management decisions. But the way that I think where the tension is we feel like we're feeding into a system where the capitalists are benefiting from it. So they're creating the Jordans. I got a pair of Jordans. I like them. They're creating the housing, and we're getting involved in the system. We're enmeshed in it in some way, and they can't make money unless we're giving them money. But I don't think that we should tie ourselves into knots worried about, whether or not we are capitalists, if we are not the ones making those decisions that are exploiting the lives of like thousands of people. I think you can, find ways to live more ethically. Like, I wouldn't tell somebody to get a $20 million house, but if you want to be comfortable, $200,000 doesn't exist anymore. But if you got the money for something that's $500,000, like you need to live. We're not worried about that. So unless you're Jeff Bezos, like at Whole Foods, trying to give people, not give them any unionizing power, then I think you're okay.
Yeah.
Just to assuage any of that.
100%. And I do think when you go back to that pie chart that you have in your book, it's important to remember. I mean, many people in this room are probably in that 20% with whatever it was, 10%, like the middle chunk.
Wealth. Yeah.
Not the 1%, but also not the bulk of the 50% that has 2% of the wealth. And so when we think about, well, it's ruining, Black people, we finally just got here. How many of us actually, though, finally just got here?
And what's here?
And what's here?
We're not making like $1 billion. You know what I mean? We're not there.
The conversation I have with my mother and my friends is that we are the talented 10th. We're the ones that made it, and we're also feeling precarity. My mother's like, how much longer am I going to have to work? How much more am I going to have to take care of all of this extended family that didn't have the benefit of being the ones that got to go to college and all of that? We're one healthcare. If you feel like you're one lost job and one bad health outcome away from being in debt, you haven't made it.
Right.
40% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. Couldn't bail out a loved one for $400. Couldn't save their life on a medical bill for $400. Couldn't prevent getting evicted for $400. Couldn't ask someone to ask someone to ask someone to get $400. That's where most of the country is. And so I do think your point about the privilege of many of us who are engaged in this conversation is real. But that is why it's so important to articulate how rare all of us in this room are in the grand scheme of what the average American economic situation looks like. Thank you. Sorry, you're so patient with us. We've gone over. Let's give it up a big hand of applause for Malaika Jabali here. It really is an amazing book.
All right, thank you both for coming. If you haven't had a chance to buy the book, we have plenty behind the